Trees are often thought of as contributing to ecosystems, and this is true, but there is a side to this story that goes so much deeper. It is well known that trees, working in concert as forests and woodlands, cool and purify the brooks, streams, and rivers that pass through them. This benefits woodland fishes, arthropods, and insects directly, and us as humans indirectly. And trees acting in concert as forests and woodlands capture and store immense amounts of woodland carbon. But trees do yet more, for every tree is an ecosystem unto itself. This can be said of all trees, from immature saplings that provide support structure for the delicate webs of spiders between their boughs, to the moderately aged trees that provide so much in the way of shelter and food for forest-dwelling creatures. But it is, above all, the great old trees of a truly mature or ancient forest that provide the most complete and comprehensive ecosystems. And this we can see both upon the yellow birch and the ancient hemlock before us. These trees, having grown up in a forest, are straight and tall, and their leaf-laden branches are high up at the top of the forest canopy where they have ready access to the full sun. But all along the way, their towering trunks provide a habitat for innumerable lichens, algae, fungi, insects, and of course birds and mammals. From the spiraling branches of this ancient hemlock to the seemingly chaotic scatter of the towering branches of great old birches and maples, high in their canopies, they form ecosystems unto themselves. A tree, due to the carbon that it captures from the atmosphere, is a carbon-reinforced superstructure, and many of the small creatures of the natural world have evolved to take advantage of these superstructures, and living along their trunks and high in their boughs, they form an ecosystem, a natural world out of each and every tree. Though it is not only in the towering boughs that trees form ecosystems, we must, in fairness and in truth, consider the ground at the base of their trunks and well down into their roots. For the ecosystems created by trees become inhabitable zones for plants that are very much dependent on the work that trees do. And flora, fungi, and many small animals form close relationships to their trees, without which they cannot survive. Among some species, such as the mysterious Monotropa uniflora, sometimes known as ghost pipe, the relationship is only just coming to be understood. For other creatures, such as this beautiful barred owl, the relationship between their lives and their trees is somewhat understood, but there are yet many questions unanswered, many facts still lying in obscurity. Today on The Naturalist, we will explore the mystery of the ecosystems that trees themselves form. Typically, people think of trees as contributing to ecosystems, and it cannot be argued that they do. This little river, deep in the Acadian forest, boasts waters as clear as crystal. It hosts sandy bottoms and little pools and detours that are perfect for the breeding of trout, and its cooling moisture is perfect for species of turtles and salamanders that live in its vicinity. And here and there along its sandy banks, one can find innumerable and often beautiful species of flora, such as these naturalized fairy night columbine that sway like enchanted bells in the partial breaks of forest shadow, as well as the much prized Matutia struthiopteris, more commonly known as the ostrich fern or fiddlehead fern, a long prized edible of northeastern forests. And down in the grasses and among the forest duff, cooled and made fertile by trees, we may find small reptiles, such as this secretive maritime garter snake, looking for a meal of small mammals, fishes, and amphibians. And this river and its surrounding riparian ecosystem are entirely made possible by the actions of trees, which cast cooling shadows and purify the water. You might think of a tree as like a terrarium. A terrarium is simply a small self-contained ecosystem, having some degree of independence from its surrounding environment. And trees can create their own ecosystems, or rather collections of ecosystems, subterranean, up the trunk, within themselves, a place I call the Woodscape, and into the canopy. We humans experience the world at about eye level, about 5.6 feet high, with the exception of a few inches either way. And thus, we are inclined to forget the world from about knee level on down. But if we could just lower our perspective a bit, we would likely discover a surprisingly different world, a place where, in tiny forest breaks, a fern patch becomes a forest unto itself, and where the undergrowth of grasses is like a jungle, where insects and small mammals form teeming herds of wildlife, and where, though we often forget to bear it in mind, the soil just beneath our feet is alive, teeming with the roots of small plants and great trees, and where any single teaspoon of forest earth contains more single-cellular organisms than there are humans that populate the planet. The subterranean ecosystem extends down as far as bedrock, and we might think of it extending up as much as knee height. It is made possible by the work of tree roots and their partners, fungi. Trees, with their mighty roots, have the power to extend their way deep underground, right down to the very stone that is Earth's foundation. And around them they develop whole ecosystems that are founded on fungi and beneficial bacteria. The fungi weave their way through every centimeter of soil, while the bacteria break down and make accessible nutrients that the fungi need. The fungi extract these nutrients and move them to the tree's roots. And trees, being photosynthetic organisms, can convert these nutrients into sugars, which they share with the fungi and their bacterial partners. Sadly, at this time, very little is known of these underground ecosystems, and the vast majority of species and their relationships are yet to be identified. Places where the forest is truly old and deep and pristine are rare in the world anymore, as countless thousands of square miles of mature and old-growth forest have fallen to the axes, the chainsaws, and the rapacious interests of sawmills and pulp and fiber companies. But pockets of old growth remain, sequestered and secure to a degree by the steep topography which surrounds them. And in this little place survives a stand of old-growth forest, especially hemlocks. It perhaps only remains by dint of luck, but in this place can be found a true ancient being, an old hemlock with a circumference of some 16 feet. A great hub or mother tree which has stood here since before the first settlers arrived from Scotland. Often, when I hike through the forest, I feel this tree's presence, the weight of its great age, like that of an embracing and benign spirit, a creature of the woodlands, a keeper and protector of the trees and soil round about, and the many, many thousands of animals that make their home among her roots, trunk, and boughs. Here I've startled a nearby red squirrel feeding in the shade of the ancient hemlock's branches. And here we find a porcupine working its way up the old hemlock. I had thought at first it might dwell in the enormous crack in the old tree, but I inspected it and there was none of the distinctive porcupine scat that looks like cylinders of sawdust. The clever porcupine had just become aware of me, even though I was being still and quiet, and went up the stout old tree to find a safe place. Before continuing to explore the ecosystems up the tree trunk, let's look again at the ground. Down there, beneath the surface of the earth, and up to a bit up the trunk, is the rhizosphere, referring to the region predominated by the tree's roots, which function in a deep symbiosis with the various unicellular organisms and fungi in which the subterranean organisms share nutrients and antimicrobials, and the trees manufacture those nutrients into sugars which they then share through their roots with the subterranean organisms. And over time, as everything breaks down, it creates soil. Rich soil, in fact, and soil, essential for all these forms of life, is not just limited to the ground. The flora and lichens on the trunk also make their own soil. For while bark is, after all, a protective skin around a tree, it is also a storehouse of carbon as well as many nutrients. Bark is frequently colonized by lichens, which secrete, as they slowly grow, powerful acids. Some lichens colonize stone, and these acids are so powerful that they can break down the stone, turning it into nutrient-rich soil which the lichens can use. And likewise, these lichens can do with bark. And this makes bark a suitable substrate for the growth of small plants like mosses. When you think of it, from the scale of a small animal such as an insect, an arachnid, or a small mammal such as a mouse or vole, the mosses and lichens which colonize a tree trunk must seem like grand forests. And the trunk of our great old hemlock is, to them, perhaps a continent. But an unfortunate yet interesting feature of this great old tree is the fact that long ago its trunk was cloven in two. Fungi have colonized that fissure, along with lichens and bacteria, and here you can see their presence demarcated by the green and pink hues. They have worked upon the interior of the great old tree, slowly wearing it down in the way of water over limestone, which creates caves. And within the tree, we find the equivalent of wooden stalactites and stalagmites. And the broken down detritus gathers at the bottom, forming soil, the equivalent of the earth to be found within a cave. The bark and wood of these great old trees also forms a resource to be mined by a variety of insects which use them for food, and these insects are themselves mined by various birds, especially woodpeckers, which drill small holes into the bark in search of these insects. Woodpeckers will also take advantage of the work of the fungi which mine the wood from the interior to carve out pockets within the wood, which may eventually become nests. The particularly thick bark of our ancient hemlock is in surprisingly good shape, but in nearby trees, various species of woodpeckers busily work, going up and down over the bark, mining for insects within that ecosystem, to feed their young, which themselves dwell within the ecosystem of the tree. This old woodpecker nest, I think, is definitely one of the most charming I've ever seen, where a woody bracket fungus overhangs like a porch. Clever of the woodpecker to find a spot which would keep the rain out. Half a mile further down in the forest lies another ancient hemlock. This one had fallen to the depredations of insects and fungi. The region where it grew was remote, presenting little chance of danger to any passers-by. But it did present a risk to other trees. If the enormous old fellow had fallen of its own accord, it could have damaged any number of trees on its way down. So it was cut, and the cutting revealed some interesting findings. There was life, both within and under the bark, as well as in the wood itself. Fungi and small insects had made their way into the wood, weakening it over the years. And after it was cut and it began to rot, the hemlock log became a habitat for small animals such as this woodlouse, who was disturbed out of hiding when I leaned a moment against the bark. They feed on dead and rotting plant material, and so one might correctly imagine that a fallen, enormous hemlock log, half rotted due to fungal attack, must be the equivalent of a giant buffet for a woodlouse. The hemlock log also became entirely interwoven with the mycelia of Ganoderma tsugae, a prized reishi mushroom. And what killed this tree? On the trunk, a crack developed, where fungi were able to work in and do their harm, weakening the great old tree, making it subject to the depredations of insects later on. In fact, insects were probably attacking it at the same time, and the mutual attack was ultimately enough to bring down the great old tree. But trees are not defenseless, and in the hollow of our ancient hemlock, the one still standing, if we look deep within the crevasse and shine some light for illumination, we can see glistening sap. Fungi need oxygen. They cannot grow if drowned in sap, and the thick sap of conifers is their best defense against fungal attack. Though, if we look overhead at the top of this wooden cavern, do you see those white dots and patches? That's fungus above where the sticky sap is pooling, pressing its advantage and its attack right to the very edge of the hemlock's defenses. The hemlock is old and strong and determined, but the fungus is patient, and it knows in the end it will win this battle. One day, be it a year or a century, the fungus will come out on top and topple this ancient hemlock. But that is not this day. This day, I think my dog and I will take a moment to just enjoy this marvelous old tree and its rare ancient forest. Meg Lohman is a scientist who studies the life specific to the canopies of trees. She, and other researchers like her, have discovered very recently that there is an entire ecosystem up there over our heads, one that can only flourish and mature to ancient forests with old, large trees that are stable, steady, long-lived, and well-established. In the canopies of these trees, from the rainforests of South America, the jungles of Africa, and the coniferous rainforests of British Columbia, and very likely anywhere old forests can still be found, in the canopies of trees, life abounds. So much life, and so many species in fact, that Meg Lohman has dubbed this previously unknown ecosystem the eighth continent. We tend to think of trees as the realms of birds, but there is far more life up there than we might imagine. The study of life in the trees, called Canopy Science, began with the haphazard scaling of great old trees, when scientists who worked their way up the trees like mountain climbers found entire self-sufficient ecosystems in the canopies, undiscovered species, mats of moss and epiphytic plants, creating, over time, layers of soil, and even smaller tree species growing in the heights. Indeed, in the canopies of old trees, it is estimated there is to be found up to 50% of the world's terrestrial biodiversity. And yet, due to the inaccessibility of treetops, this, aptly dubbed eighth continent, was only recently discovered, and tree branches turned out to be more than places for birds to perch. One need only walk briefly in the forest to realize there are countless species of mosses, small plants, algae, and lichens whose lives are tied closely to those of the trees. As I circle this ancient yellow birch, which must be at least 150 years old, I am struck by the biodiversity growing from ground to boughs up this tree's trunk. But I can't explore it. Being a mere human, I am confined to the perspective of the ground, focused, if not upon the trunks of trees, then the soil beneath my feet. But Canopy Science has opened up a whole new realm of awareness. And overhead, in those arcing boughs, what mysteries might there be waiting to be discovered? Especially in the great old trees, like these, ever rarer in the world today. Primarily, Canopy Science is done in the jungles of the Amazon, Africa, and more recently, the Pacific coast of North America, in the rainforests. But here, in the Acadian forest where I dwell, Canopy Science seems to be at best in its infancy. I know of very little research done on species specific to Acadian forest canopies. Perhaps we humans have just done too much harm to our forests to really justify Canopy Science in this area now. Canopy species seem to be most abundant in areas of mature and old-growth woods, and less than 1% of the old-growth forests of the Acadian regions remain, and that only in scattered pockets. But, as Michael Crichton once wrote in his remarkable novel Jurassic Park, life finds a way. And in my heart, I don't yet doubt that there are new species, new ecosystems, and new ecological secrets up there in the canopies of the trees, yet to be revealed. The development of modern drones, which are small and affordable, and provide stable high-resolution videography and photography platforms, will do a lot to make those upper canopies accessible. And even great trees such as this towering conifer growing near a waterfall, which my drone's altimeter reported was over 30 meters tall, now becomes accessible to basic study. Though professional canopy scientists have access to much more refined tools, sky bridges such as this one, cranes placed at considerable expense deep in the forest where the old giant trees dwell, and even floating dirigibles to allow them to get close to those trees and examine that high-altitude life from arm's length and take samples. Though even from ground level, it is evident that countless organisms rely on trees. Wildlands of mosses, lichens, epiphytic plants, and fungi are completely reliant on them. And it seems like, with every new expedition to the eighth continent, scientists report the discovery of yet more new species. Unsurprising given that it is now estimated that up to 90% of tropical biodiversity resides in those canopies. In the end, unless felled by forest fire, every tree ends up a log. This is a log of a great old tree more than 2 feet in diameter that fell decades ago and since has slowly been rejoining the cycle of ecology within its environment. But even at the very end of its life, every tree continues to offer ecosystems. And down there, in the cavity of its trunk, we find an aperture sufficient to shelter small to medium-sized mammals, as well as numerous insects, arachnids, and arthropods. Let's return to our great old hemlock log, the one that had been cut to force a controlled fall to keep it from harming other old trees. It is a home now to countless species, and we see in this image here 2 Ganoderma fruiting bodies in development, as well as other species of lichens and fungi, and in the background, mosses are developing. And as we saw earlier, various small animals dwell in the craggy bark, such as this woodlouse, a creature often mistaken for an insect, but which is in fact a crustacean related to a lobster. Like the side of a living tree trunk, the surface of this log is a world unto itself, like a forest ecosystem but in miniature for the small animals that live upon it. Its bark presents a rough and craggy landscape, and moss and lichens provide cover, retain water, and prevent erosion from the surface of the log, much the way larger plants would work in a full-size forest, that is to say, a human-scale forest. Leaves that land on the log decay and become soil, and nutrients to feed the flora that grows upon the log. And on this side of the log we see the desiccated husk of a Ganoderma fruiting body, Hemlock reishi, which emerged several years ago, rising from the log's surface like mountains, and evidence of the mycelial threads which grow throughout the log, working and breaking down the wood, much as earthworms would work and break down nutrient within good garden soil. And at the back of our log, the pièce de résistance, for we see that this log plays nursery. A tiny sapling grows upon it, and one day, if luck fares well for the little sapling, it too might flourish and become one of the great old birches of this forest. Over a number of decades, perhaps as much as 100 years depending upon climatic conditions, the ancient fallen hemlock will eventually come to look like this, a crumbling remnant of its former self. The substantial squarish chunks are the results of fungal decay, and as they are decayed, their nutrients are unlocked. We can see this in the many saplings growing on and immediately around the old log. And so it is that even at the very end of their lives, trees serve as ecosystems unto themselves, becoming ideal habitats for other life to live and new tree life to begin. But this is ultimately the way of nature, a spiral that spins round and round, always moving forward, always revisiting its origins, and never quite making the same journey twice. And in that journey, there is a deep and sublime beauty. For even here, where we see the tiny sapling rising out of the old conifer stump, we see in this rebirth that trees carry within them a mystery. They don't just give to ecosystems, they are ecosystems. Indeed, they are worlds within worlds. Thank you for watching. The Naturalist program is committed to the reliable coverage of natural science and environmental issues. If you like our program, please take a moment to subscribe and like.
Autumn leaves are turning brown, branches bare.